Very popular, Michael. I think it's the guest introduction with Melina.
All right. If you guys would take your seats, there are a couple more seats. There's two up there. One up there. All right, we're going to get started. All right, is the AV ready? That's a yes. All right. All right, ladies and gentlemen, hello. Welcome to Case Western Reserve University School of Law. I'm Michael Scharf, the co-dean. This is our very first event for the 2019-2020 event season. And we have all kinds of really exciting things in store for you. And if you didn't, you can grab one of our brochures listing the 38 different lectures and conferences that we will be having this year. We're kicking things off with the annual Klatsky Lecture. And the history of the Klatsky Lecture is that Bruce Klatsky, who was a member of our trustee, about 20 years ago decided that this law school needed a human rights program. And some of you are thinking, it needed one? We're so well known for human rights now. It all started with Bruce Klatsky. He gave us a very generous endowment that puts two of our students each year at Human Rights Watch. And he organized it so that Human Rights Watch has to take our students. And the about 40 students who have done that over the years have gone on to really illustrious careers in human rights. In addition, he established this lecture series. And we have supplemented this series with the Humanitarian of the Year Award that has been called in the plain dealer Cleveland's version of the Nobel. And we have given this award, which is associated with the Klatsky Lecture, to some of the most amazing practitioners and officials and human rights advocates in the world. They include 2 UN High Commissioners for Human Rights, 2 International Court of Justice judges, 6 international prosecutors, 2 legal advisors at the State Department, 1 Assistant Secretary for Human Rights, and the list goes on. And we're excited about adding to that list, and you'll hear more about that in a second. I do want to mention something about Bruce Klatsky, because he was not able to be here today, but he is in his own right an exemplar for human rights. He was the CEO of Philips von Heusen Corporation, and he was one of the first major corporations in the world to decide that it's better business to have your company adhere to human rights standards wherever it practices around the world. So think about companies that are faced with child labor issues and trafficking and bad conditions. He was the one who said it is good for business if we can lead by example. And so we're very proud to be associated with Bruce Klatsky and to have this lecture in his name and our award that we give each year. So to tell you a little bit about the background of this year's award recipient and the Klatsky Lecturer, I would like to invite my colleague Melina Stereo, who I've written several books with, and we work together often. And she is just down the street at Cleveland Marshall, a partner in many things international. And then I'm going to add a couple of stories after she gives the details. So bring it in, Melina.
Good afternoon. It's great to see so many of you here, including my own students. So thanks for coming. You're in for a treat. So before I do the official introduction, I wanted to do the following. So Professor Williams, when he does workshops and talks to students, he likes to do this. He likes to ask everybody to share a fun fact about themselves. And it's a really nice icebreaker, and people say things like, I have a motorcycle license, and my first dog weighed 140 pounds, and stuff like that. So I'm going to share a fun fact about Professor Williams. Professor Williams gets hungry, or should I say hangry, every 2 hours, right, Dean Scharf? About. So if you know that about him, you travel with him, as long as you carry snacks or you're willing to go for ice cream 3 times a day, all is good. But on a more serious note, Professor Paul Williams is the Grazier Professor of Law and International Relations at American University and the president and also co-founder of the Public International Law and Policy Group, which is based in Washington, D.C. In 2005, Dr. Williams, as executive director of the Public International Law and Policy Group, was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by his pro bono government clients. Dr. Williams has assisted over a dozen clients in major international peace negotiations, including serving as a delegation member in the Dayton and Doha negotiations. He has advised parties to the Key West, Oslo, Geneva, and Georgia Abkhaz negotiations, as well as the Somalia peace talks, and many, many other peace talks and negotiations. We would be here for an hour if I read you the list of all of them. And Professor Williams wouldn't have time to speak. Not fun. Previously, Dr. Williams served in the Department of State's Office of the Legal Advisor for European and Canadian Affairs as a senior associate with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and as a Fulbright Research Scholar at the University of Cambridge. He holds a BA from the University of California at Davis, a JD from Stanford Law School, and then a PhD in International Relations from the University of Cambridge. He has published numerous law articles, numerous books, is truly a renowned expert in international law and peace negotiations. So with that, I'll hand it over to Dean Scharf, who's now going to share a few more fun facts about Professor Williams.
Thank you, Milena. So, and Milena, part of why I asked her to do this introduction is because the two of us are the other two of the three board of directors of the Public International Law and Policy Group. So the three of us have been running this NGO. The way the NGO began was that Paul and I worked at the U.S. Department of State. I was attorney advisor for UN Affairs up at the UN. Paul was attorney advisor for European Affairs, and we were working on the Yugoslav crisis. And I didn't know him because he was the new arrival, and he started emailing me back and forth. He'd say, Scharf, I hear you're the guy that does Security Council resolutions. We have to have one to create the Yugoslavia commission of experts to investigate the crisis. And then he'd say, Scharf, we have to have a resolution to create an international tribunal for Yugoslavia, and so on and so on. And I didn't meet him till after he and I had worked on a bunch of these resolutions together. While we were working at the State Department, I decided to go into academia. I had been teaching at Georgetown in the evenings and really loved it. He decided he wanted a PhD and then go into academia, which he did at Cambridge. And before we left, we said, we don't want to be those kinds of professors that are just in the ivory tower. We think that the students will respect us more, will be more interesting if we keep one foot in the field. So we decided to create an NGO called the Public International Law and Policy Group. One of our friends who Giuslino now knows very well, Mark Barnett, who was then at Steptoe & Johnson, he's now a judge of the U.S. Court of International Trade, he got us our incorporation, our nonprofit status. And then another friend of ours, Peter Spiro, he got us our NGO status at the UN. So it's like a big group of friends creating this little NGO in a garage. Well, this NGO grew and grew and grew and grew, and it now gets about $6 million a year in USAID, DRL, EU, Canadian, Dutch, and all other kinds of grants. And it's got about 12 offices a year, depending on, around the world a year, depending on the different projects. It's got a main office that is right across the street from the White House. And it's in one of these, what are they called? A WeWork space, which is very new. Have you ever been to one of those? It's like big open space, and they've got putt-putt and ping pong balls and free beer and coffee, and then you're working. So it's like the space for your generation. But all of you who are interested in international law, you do have to know that sometimes things get a little hairy out there in the field. And one of the things that people ask me about as a dean sometimes is like, isn't this a really tough job? Don't you get down? Don't you let like the weight of these decisions and the tough decisions you're making and the things you're working with, the crises, get you down? And I'm like, are you kidding? When I was working with Paul in the field, we were looking at life and death things. It's all relative. So let me tell you a couple of these little stories to give you a sense of that. So Paul and I once went to Istanbul with a bunch of judges who had snuck out of Syria to create an international tribunal charter for the Syria crisis under this optimistic view that Assad was about to fall from power and there'd be accountability. Didn't happen. But anyway, we're hanging out in Istanbul, and down the street from us in Taksim Square, the students are rioting because Erdogan decided to make the drinking, the time that you can go to bars, stop at 10 o'clock p.m. And what you might not know about Istanbul is a huge college town. There's, I think, 70 colleges there. So there was this big uprising, the student uprising. We'll call it the beer uprising. And Erdogan did like a Tiananmen Square. He sent the army out, and they did water cannons and tear gas, and all these kids ran away from Taksim Square, and we were just hanging out at this other square about a mile away, quietly at a Starbucks, and suddenly we were surrounded by about 50,000 students. And then the smell of tear gas, and then the yelling and the screaming, and then the next thing we know, we were running with like the bulls at Pimpluma, right? I mean, you think about 70,000 people screaming and running as fast as they can, and we thought we'd be trampled like a Who concert. I don't know if anybody knows that reference anymore, but yeah. So that was one example. Others, we were in Libya. My wife, who's with us today, Trina, says, you know, they just had a civil war in Libya. Gaddafi was just killed. It's not a safe place. You stay in Tripoli. And I told Paul, we're going to stay in Tripoli, right? He said, right. So the first day we get there, he says, we're going to Misrata. Misrata was like the most dangerous place. And there are child soldiers at the checkpoints. And so Paul, who's very tall and usually sits in the front seat, he says, Michael, I'm going to let you sit in the front seat. I had no idea why. So I was like, that's very generous of you, Paul. I'm usually squished in the back with my small frame. So I'm in the front seat. We are at the checkpoint. The car in front of us stops. The child soldier pulls the person out of the passenger seat, starts interrogating him, and then starts beating him with his AK-47 machine gun on the head. And the guy's screaming and yelling, I haven't done anything, I haven't done anything. And then the child soldier lets him go. Then it was our turn. We come up, and I'm sitting there, and I'm looking back at Paul. I'm like, what did you get me into? Luckily, our driver spoke Arabic and started speaking rapid-fire Arabic at the child soldier. They spoke back and forth. The child soldier looked very disappointed and waved us forward. I said, what did you say to save my life? He says, oh, it just coincidentally happens that I know that guy's dad. And I said, I'm going to tell his dad on him if he beats up my passenger. So that was very fortunate. While Paul was in Libya, you may have heard of the Benghazi incident. It was featured in the movie 30 Hours? Is that what? 13 Hours. Anybody see that movie? All right, so what happened in Benghazi basically is there was an attack on the U.S. consulate there. The U.S. ambassador was killed. The United States decided to leave Tripoli because it was too dangerous. And I think they went to Istanbul. That was the safe place. Well, Paul was working there with a couple of other PILPG people on a contract for the U.S. State Department, and no one told him. And so he gets on his cell phone. He's like, I can't get out, and there's a crisis going on. Where are all of you guys? And they weren't there. They weren't answering the phone. He did ultimately get out. He is with us. But then he went off to other trips, like the time he went to Yemen. Now, how many of you are with the Yemen Accountability Project? All right, so you guys get to work on this and read about it in the safety of Case Western Reserve. He was at Yemen doing peace negotiations, and there were literally bombs going off and machine guns being fired all around his hotel. And he's emailing me saying, things are getting a little exciting here in Yemen. I may be leaving a little bit early. But Paul has seen it all, and it is a very exciting life. And what he does is he brings suitcases to the ground. He's a lawyer, and his group, the Public International Law and Policy Group, are the pro bono lawyers for the world, and they have been involved in the most exciting things. Paul is convinced that the peace negotiations he's been involved in only work when accountability is a part of it, and that's what he's going to be talking about today, and that's what he's brought to the world. And for that, we want to honor him with this year's Cox Center Humanitarian of the Year Award. So if you'll come down, Paul. And Elena, we do not have a photographer, do we? So does anybody have an iPhone and they'll send us a picture? All right, we'll just do it the old-fashioned way. Yeah, go ahead. All right. So it is with great honor that we give you this award.
And we'll do that. There we go. There we go. Smile.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And we look forward to your remarks today. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Milena. I'm tempted to spend my 20 minutes telling Mike Scharf stories, but I only have one that I will share with you. And it was a decade ago in this very room, or maybe more than a decade, and Michael was receiving the chair that he holds. And Michael said, Paul, you have to come and give a very serious description of my scholarship and my work and my contribution. Yeah, no problem, Mike. We're not going to Misrata. And so I started my thing by saying, Mike Scharf is the Taylor Swift of international law. And it pretty much went that way for the next 15 minutes while I talked about his career in comparison to Taylor Swift. He still has not forgiven me. I'm very excited about the opportunity to spend the next 20 minutes with you, sort of sharing my thoughts on the role of accountability in peace negotiations, and then to throw it open for about 20 minutes of Q&A. I know that I'm supposed to talk for about 30 or 35, but having spent the weekend in Chautauqua with many of you from the War Crimes Project and with Amanda and Kristen sort of serving as our rapporteur and making me sound a lot smarter than I actually am, and a little sad that I didn't have you help me write the speech. I wanted just to keep it to 20 minutes so we can throw it open for the Q&A. I also know that there are a number of students from Cleveland Marshall that have also come down from downtown to spend some time with us, so I want to make sure that we've got plenty of time for the students, the faculty, and the others to jump in with questions and share your views. I do want to express my deep appreciation to Bruce Klatsky for endowing the lecture and the award. He has had decades-long commitment both to global human rights as well as to Case Western, and it's impressive to see his depth and the tenure of his commitment to this university, Case Western Reserve University School of Law, and to this university as well as to human rights, actual on the ground and implementation. What I want to talk about is this notion of peace with justice and how whenever the international community goes into a peace negotiation, there's always this peace first rush. There's always this, we just got to get a deal. We just got to get to yes. We just got to get the parties to sign something, and then we will have an agreement, we'll have peace, and then we can worry about justice and other things down the road. Ambassador Dick Holbrooke, who negotiated the Dayton Accords, is famous for saying, yes, 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 I know Milosevic. He's the arsonist. He's the one that started the genocide, the crimes against humanity in the Balkans, but he's also the fireman. And so we need Milosevic, the fireman now, not Milosevic, the arsonist. Well, kind of when you're an arsonist, you're kind of an arsonist, and you're not really so much a fireman. So I want to replace that metaphor with a Wile E. Coyote metaphor, the Roadrunner. Now, so many of you that are my age and in this universe will sort of understand Wile E. Coyote. If you're not and you don't know, just ask your parents and they'll tell you, which is not what I tell them. Google it or ask mom and dad. There was a cartoon when I was a kid, and there was a Roadrunner, and he was always running around. And there was a coyote who was constantly trying to capture and eat the Roadrunner. And he came up with all kinds of crazy and innovative ways of doing it, and he never succeeded. Don't remember that part of the story. Remember that every Saturday morning, Coyote was back there trying to get the Roadrunner. And the reality is, probably 9 out of 10 kids actually rooted for the Coyote and not the Roadrunner. And justice is a little bit that way. Justice tends to be perceived as failing quite frequently, being pushed off to the side, getting agreements with impunity, or locking in some type of immunity for the perpetrators, but justice always keeps coming back. And that's what I want to spend the next 15 or 16 minutes talking about, is the way in which justice has found its foothold in the peace process, and then what you all can be doing to help to continue your efforts on the Yemen Accountability Project, the War Crimes Lab that you're working with, the various Cox Center projects that you have on Lebanon, the International Criminal Court, the Cambodia Tribunal, all of those things that you're doing, how you can continue to work to ensure that those accountability stepping stones are laid in the actual peace negotiations. Now, the Coyote, Justice, didn't have a very successful start. And if we look back to 1923, there is the Lausanne Peace Treaty, which basically sorted things out between a number of countries, but also the Turks and the Armenians, and it essentially provided for amnesty, impunity for the crimes, the genocide crimes that were committed against the Armenians, and that set the tone for then what would happen in World War II. And you had the burst of the Tokyo Tribunal and the Nuremberg Tribunal, where there was this effort to bring accountability back into building a durable peace. But very quickly, those that were negotiating agreements moved back to impunity. The French and the Algerians negotiated the Avion Accords. The first paragraph of one of the protocols very clearly and in great detail explains the immunity that the Algerian forces and the French forces were entitled to as a result of signing this agreement. Most of you then know that Algeria kicked into a very brutal civil war years later, where the tactics and the atrocities that were committed essentially mirrored those that were committed in the French-Algerian War. You had the Cambodia situation, where they signed an agreement and there was no immunity. The United Nations helped negotiate this agreement and sent a little note saying we're bothered by the fact that there's an immunity provision for these accords, but they let it lie. It took 20 years before the Cambodia tribunal that many of you are working on actually came into play, because the Cambodians had deep regret about the fact of trading justice in order to get peace. You had the Congo. The president and the prime minister of the Congo, at the time it was called Zaire, as part of the deal to bring an end to the first conflict, received asylum in Spain and in France. Subsequently, there was a second Congolese war. 5 million people were killed in that war. And currently, the International Criminal Court, its largest number of cases, comes from the Congo, from former Zaire. The Yemen project that you're working on, the Gulf Cooperation Council, which was an agreement in Yemen in 2011, which was negotiated under the auspices of the United Nations, Article 1A specifically provides for immunity for President Saleh and those involved in his governing regime. So not only did the agreement not talk about accountability, they went out of their way to write out specific accountability for impunity for an individual and those that were associated with his regime. So what happened in Yemen? He sat around for a couple of years, he watched the peace process, decided it wasn't going his way, teamed up with the Houthis, and launched us into the civil war that we have in Yemen, which is putting probably 25 million Yemenis on the brink of famine. Now, there was justice in a sense. The Houthis said, thank you very much, President Saleh, for your money. Thank you for your weapons. We're now going to assassinate you and take over your cadre of child soldiers and militia. So he has been moved off of the scene, but you have a second wave of consequence for that impunity, and that is that last week, South Yemen announced its bid for secession from Yemen. There was conflict in 90 and 94 in Yemen. There was no accountability. There were no trials. And the Southerners have now said, this is not the Yemen that we want to be a part of. And they've declared their independence, and they've captured Aden, which is the capital city of Yemen. So hopefully, when there is a peace process in Yemen, the United Nations and others will have learned their lesson. They'll call Laura, they'll call Jim Johnson, and they'll say, send us over that data from the Yemen Accountability Project, because we need to hold individuals accountable in order to move into a lasting peace. Two more historical examples, then I'll move into some more of the contemporary ones. Uganda, Idi Amin. After the Tanzanians came into Uganda in order to cut a peace, Idi Amin went, after supervising the killing of 500,000 individuals, went to Saudi Arabia on a beachside villa for 25 years and lived out his life peacefully. Now, the Ugandans were one of the very first countries to put to the International Criminal Court the jurisdiction for the Lord's Resistance Army, and with the assistance of Sharf, they have created a domestic war crimes tribunal where they are prosecuting other individuals from the Lord's Resistance Army. They learned their lesson many 40 years late, that you're not going to have a durable peace unless you have some degree of accountability. And then the last one was Bangladesh and Pakistan. In order for Pakistan to recognize Bangladesh in 1973, Pakistan's condition was that there would be immunity for anybody who had committed atrocities or crimes. 3 years ago, Bangladesh created trials to finally try the perpetrators for the crimes that had committed in that 1973 conflict. And as I'll end in my concluding remarks, Bangladesh is now taking the lead on seeking justice for the Rohingya, who are subject to the genocide in Aung San Suu Kyi's Burma. So that's a bit of a characterization of the bad old days. I know I'm supposed to talk about justice and the peace process, and now we're going to shift into sort of where justice started to get some wind in its sails. And you'll oftentimes hear that with the end of the Cold War and the emergence of the war in Yugoslavia, the international community realized that you needed to have justice in order to have a durable peace. And all of those that worked on this in the early 90s were guided by this notion of justice is the way. That's not the real story. What happened is the State Department and many of the European countries, the US government through the State Department and other European countries, didn't know what to do when Yugoslavia was dissolving. There was the war in Croatia, there was the war in Bosnia. It was characterized by crimes against humanity, genocide, 200,000 were killed. They deployed a UN peacekeeping force, UNPRO 4-1. That didn't work. They deployed a second peacekeeping force, UNPRO 4-2. That didn't work. They deployed a no-fly zone, and after 354 violations of the no-fly zone, they actually passed a resolution to enforce the no-fly zone by shooting down planes that were violating it. That still didn't work. They did an economic embargo. This is when I was like emailing Scharf and saying, we need a resolution on arms embargo. We need a resolution on a no-fly zone. Then at the noon press briefing, Secretary Eagleberger said, I stand up, and every noon press briefing, Roy Gutman, who will be at your conference in September giving the keynote speech, asks me, what are we doing? We're not doing anything. We've tried everything. Hey, lawyers, we need something. And we said, hey, why don't you create a tribunal? And the State Department said, well, let's create a commission of inquiry. And they appointed Sharif Bassioni, professor from DePaul. I figured it'd take him a few years to move on this issue. 6-9 months, he said, atrocities have occurred. We need a tribunal. The French, the British, the Americans were so desperate to do something, they created a Yugoslav tribunal. It took them a year to appoint a prosecutor, Justice Goldstone, for that tribunal. But Justice Goldstone, South African, who'd been on the Constitutional Court, who'd been engaged in the Truth Commission, he showed up and he started indicting people. And the international community was astounded. He actually, and this is now public because he said it yesterday in Chautauqua, the Secretary General called him and said, what are you doing? And he said, I'm a prosecutor. I'm indicting people. He's like, you're a UN prosecutor. And he's like, yeah, I may wear a blue baseball cap, but I'm still a prosecutor. And what he had done to get the ire of the UN is there were a political and a military leader in Yugoslavia, in the Bosnia, General Mladic, who was responsible for the Srebrenica genocide, which many of you know about, and then Radovan Karadzic, who was the political leader, who was largely responsible for the siege of Sarajevo, the 12,000 individuals who were killed there. And the Dayton peace process was on the horizon, and everyone was saying, we're going to get to Dayton, it's just down the road, we're going to get to yes, we're going to end the conflict. And Goldstone was like, I've got a lot of information that Karadzic and Mladic are responsible for crimes against humanity. I'm going to indict them. And he did in the summer of '95, right before the Dayton Accords. He was accused of undermining the Accords. But the reality is, and I was working with the Bosnians at this time as their lawyer, they would not have gone to Dayton. They would not have been able to sit across the table from Radovan Karadzic, who was laying siege to Sarajevo at that very time, or General Mladic, who was teeing up the Srebrenica massacre at that time. They could only go if those two were removed from the scene. So this is an interesting case where the tribunal intervened to remove actors from the scene so that they wouldn't contaminate the peace process, and you might have a chance. Now, interestingly, at Dayton, Justice Goldstone rang up Dick Holbrooke and said, you need to have provisions in the Dayton Peace Accords that do two things. One, that obligate the parties to cooperate with the War Crimes Tribunal and turn people over. And two, you need to obligate the NATO forces, 50,000 NATO forces. The 1st Armored Division was being deployed from Germany. You need to mandate that they arrest indicted war criminals. Neither of those things happened. There were some provisions about cooperation and how you couldn't run for political office if you were an indicted war criminal. But this is where I learned, as a young professional, I was 29 at the time, to be deeply skeptical of everything you hear and to always push and push and push for the issues that you care about. I was with President Izbegovic. We were working with Holbrooke and his team about putting in these provisions for accountability. And the chief lawyer for the Americans, which was an old colleague of Michael and mine at the time, because I'd left State Department just a year or two before, had said, look, we were on the phone with Justice Goldstone. He says these provisions are fine. You can't be more holy than the Pope. Now, the Bosnians weren't Catholic. The Croats were Catholic. So that didn't really work for them. And they never called Goldstone. Years later, I told the story to Richard Goldstone. He says, no, I'm yelling at him to get these two provisions in. I'm like, oh, they're telling us you're good with this. And then Secretary Christopher, when the Dayton Accords were signed, titled his remarks, peace with justice. And then the Dayton Accords were signed by 4 individuals. President Izbegovic, who went on to be the president of Bosnia. They were also signed by President Milosevic, who was subsequently indicted for crimes against humanity in Bosnia and in Kosovo, and was put on trial in The Hague. He died during the course of his trial. He was turned over by the Serbians years later when they wanted to finally move away from their nationalist regime, and they thought, we have President Milosevic, he's sticking around causing trouble, what do? Let's send him to The Hague. So ironically, The Hague's work on justice in Bosnia has had probably more of an impact in Serbia by allowing them to send their former president away to The Hague. It was also signed by Krajišnik, who then went on to serve 2 years as the president of Bosnia before the French kicked down his door in the middle of the night, arrested him in his pajamas, and took him to The Hague, where he stood trial for crimes against humanity. And the 4th signator to this Peace with Justice agreement was President Tudjman, who was in the process of being indicted for war crimes committed against the Serbs and the Bosnians before he passed away. And so even when you had an active and heavily engaged tribunal, you had an active and heavily engaged prosecutor, they were still going with the firemen. They weren't acknowledging that many of these players were the arsonist. I'll then move on now to Sierra Leone, because you have a real-life action hero here at Case Western. Jim Johnson, who is one of your adjunct professors, runs the War Crimes Lab, works with Laura on the Yemen Accountability Project, put the first head of state in jail for crimes against humanity. So in Sierra Leone, there was a brutal conflict funded by blood diamonds, instigated and fueled by support from Liberia under the leadership of President Taylor, and was marked by gross atrocities. They signed a peace agreement. The peace agreement again provided for amnesty by name for Sankar, who was the head of the Revolutionary United Front, the RUF. He said, thank you very much for this peace agreement and for this amnesty, and he promptly went and took hostage 15 UN peacekeepers in order to show everybody who was boss. The Brits had had enough. The Brits sent in their special forces, they freed the peacekeepers, they captured him, and then they looked at the Sierra Leoneans and they said, get us a tribunal. The president of Sierra Leone sent a note to the Security Council and said, we'd like a hybrid tribunal, a mixed tribunal between internationals and our own lawyers. And they put Charles Taylor, well, first they captured, the Brits had already captured Sankar, turned him over, tried him for crimes against humanity, convicted, and he died while he was in custody serving his time. They then indicted Charles Taylor. And again, the United Nations said, what are you doing? And Jim Johnson and David Crane were like, we're prosecutors. This is what we do. We put bad people in jail. You're UN prosecutors. And like, nah, we're hybrid. And we are working to protect and promote durable peace in Sierra Leone. Taylor is now serving his time in London, of all things. And he just recently had his cell phone privileges revoked because he's trying to stir up a political regime change in Liberia. So the Brits have taken away his cell phone privileges. Let me turn to, because I want a couple more minutes, and then I do want to throw it open for the Q&A, and I'm happy during the Q&A to talk about Iraq, the ICC, Sudan, Colombia, Syria, Haiti. These are all ones I've sort of glanced over. But I want us to talk about Burma and what's happening there. The Rohingya, almost 1 million Rohingya have been subjected to genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes. They've been pushed out of their ancestral homeland in Burma into Bangladesh. Bangladesh keeps them along the borders. Mike, Milena, and I, and PLPG, at the request of the State Department, because things do change with this arc of accountability, asked us to deploy 18 investigators, former investigators from these various tribunals, to go and interview over 1,000 Rohingya refugees. And we thought we would go and we would interview and we'd sort of hear what we were hearing in the newspaper. We'd collect some evidence, some testimony. We had a secure database. We had translators. And everyone had been in the field in Darfur, in Sierra Leone, in Cambodia. And after the first week, the team got together and we said, okay, let's do an assessment of where we are. And to a person, every one of the investigators said, this is worse than anything we've ever seen before. And these are folks who were in Darfur, who were in the Central African Republic, who took testimony from the Bosnians and the Croats and the Serbs, the Kosovars. And this was, as far as they'd seen it before, 94% of the individuals that we spoke with, and this was a random sampling. The State Department actually created this statistical model because we're a nonprofit. And they're like, you guys, you'll go to the market, you'll find 10 people to talk to. They'll all tell you the same story. You'll say, oh yeah, we interviewed 10 people. They're like, no, you have to go to all 34 of the camps. You have to make sure that you geographically spread, and we have GPS, we're tracking you. Oh, to rescue us? No, we're tracking you to make sure you actually go to all of the corners of the camps. And 94% of the individuals we spoke with, and we had a random sampling within the homes as well. So we random sampled the home and then randomly sampled the individual in. 94% had witnessed or been victims of these atrocities. The current international policy is Aung San Suu Kyi is our friend. If we are aggressive on this, the Chinese will come in and they'll own Burma, Myanmar. We want it to be part of the West, so we need to go easy on this. Bangladesh, of all countries, have said, whoa, we've been here before. Going easy on the bad guys does not work. And so Bangladesh put a case to the International Criminal Court on a very thin edge of the Rome Statute, which is the basis of jurisdiction, which says the Rohingya refugees who are being pushed into Bangladesh, that's a war crime. That's a crime of genocide. And since the consequence is felt in Bangladesh, because that's where the Rohingya come, the ICC should have jurisdiction. And there's a pretrial finding that the ICC does have jurisdiction, and the prosecutor has been authorized to launch an investigation. And so the hope is at a time when pretty much the entire world knows that the Rohingya are being victims of crime against humanity and genocide, and the entire world is not doing much about it, it's this one little institution in The Hague, the International Criminal Court, and this one small country, Bangladesh, which is punching above its weight and saying, we're not going to solve this problem unless those that are committing these crimes are held accountable. And they're trying to set the tone in the way that Justice Goldstone set the tone 20, 30 years ago with his indictments of Karadzic and Mladic. I have hit my 20 minutes, so I'm going to now throw it open. We have about 20 minutes left for Q&A. And like I said, I'm happy to talk about any of the case studies that we chatted about. I'm happy to tell more stories about from the inside of peace negotiations, or any other place where there's, in your view, accountability issues or peace negotiation issues. I'm happy to chat about. State your name and your affiliation, so that'll be great.
Microphone. Would someone just volunteer to take the mic around to help us facilitate that? So this is because we are webcasting this, and the 100 of you that are watching it are being joined by maybe 1,000 people around the world who are also watching it.
My name is Peter Mohnhauer. I'm a 2L here at Case Western, and my question is, in countries where these crimes occur, how much of a role does education play, like educating the population and helping achieve justice? Because if you look at, for example, it's not working. Oh, there it goes. If you look at Nuremberg, that helped deal with the initial war criminals. And then it wasn't until the Frankfurt trials in 1963, I believe, that the German population as a whole really came around to preserving human rights.
Yeah, education is crucial, but think of it initially as an antidote. Because we think about it as, okay, we want to educate people about what actually happened so that it won't occur again, they'll do a durable peace. The reality is you need to start with the education initiatives and basing it as necessary, as needed from the tribunals, because there's so much negative education. And I'll tell you a story which will gross you out, but it's you'll remember 5 things from this presentation. So I'm always trying to figure out which 5 things I can get into your head that you'll then remember in terms of the firemen and the arsonists. But in Yugoslavia, when you need to round up the suburbanites to go and commit atrocities, you need to energize them and inspire them. And so what the Bosnians had done is they had said, in Serbia, there's the 3-finger salute. And so the Serbs said, you know what the Bosnians are doing? They're capturing our children. They're cutting off their 2 fingers. So for the rest of their life, they can only make the 3-finger Serbian salute. And that got people fired up. And then in order to get the Serbs inspired or fired up, it's, the Bosnians tend to roast lamb. Well, they're capturing our kids and they're basically doing that to our children. And that's how you got the suburbanite population to go out there and then commit these atrocities. Because it wasn't just small groups of paramilitary, it was, fairly widespread. Rwanda, 800,000 people were killed in a matter of weeks. Everybody was partaking in that. So the first step of education is to be like, whoa. First of all of those myths weren't true. And what happened is because you bought into those myths, you as otherwise normal, well-adjusted people, committed these atrocities. And these atrocities occurred. Here's a court in The Hague, or in the case of Rwanda, in Arusha, or in Sierra Leone. It was actually in Freetown, Sierra Leone, which has gone through a legal and intense legal process, which is long, which is expensive, which is surprisingly boring, but it's a detailed process that has created an accurate historical record to then use that as the basis for the initiative to educate about who was responsible, what happened, and why you can't just ignore it, because otherwise reasonable people will be inspired into, tricked into, manipulated into committing these crimes. And so the education is the key, but translating these 300-page decisions from these tribunals to, textbooks, op-eds, hour and a half or minute and a half presentations on television is exceedingly difficult. That was not a minute and a half answer, sorry. Other questions, thoughts, comments? Yes. Microphone down here in the front.
Thanks. I'm Alan Dowling, I'm a 1L. So we found at the end of last year that some Burmese military officials were making some of these awful social media posts inciting violence and crimes against humanity. What are some of the international legal repercussions of the Burmese military's implication with these social media posts?
So what you'd find is that the Burmese military individuals who were inciting the commission of war crimes would be responsible, those individuals, and I think I know where your question is heading, so let me do it in two parts, would be responsible for the crime of incitement or of aiding and abetting. So Belana Plavsic was a biology professor in Bosnia, and she announced with great authority that the Bosniak Muslims were genetically inferior. And she was a biologist and she knew this, and therefore, take what you wish in the middle of a conflict. If they're biologically inferior, well, then you can probably kill them. She was convicted of genocide, aiding and abetting genocide, because of that type of straightforward fake news, so to speak. It's clear precedent that these Burmese generals that are doing this are responsible. Now the question is, whoa, Facebook, Twitter, other social media platforms, they're allowing this to happen. And this is where you clash with the different cultures. The Americans, the First Amendment, are on one end of it. The British are much more, this looks like, you're aiding and abetting. Just because it's a platform doesn't mean you can or you can let anybody say what they want to do. We have a domestic legislation which essentially protects high tech. But high tech's not doing so well lately as far as Congress is concerned. And so now might be the opportunity for advocacy to reshape those rules, to say that these social media platforms are responsible in an aiding and abetting environment if they do allow this insightful information to be put on their platforms. They can't simply say, we're just a platform, thank you for our $1 billion of revenue, we have nothing to do with this. They should take action to pull these things off, not just because they're good citizens, but because there's potential criminal liability. I tend to be very about that, so glad you asked that question. Other questions? I give mellow answers too, so yeah, go ahead.
Who's got it? Okay.
Hi, I'm Liz.
You're in Raising the Bar. You play the violin, right?
Everyone should enjoy the law school band.
Which changes colors when you play it.
It does. That's just it's
Okay.
an LED strip, but kind of piggybacking off of the social media platform comment, at Chautauqua we kind of discussed this as well, but if you're going to ask social media platforms or even Google to pull insightful rhetoric off, is there a mechanism or a way that we can still gain access to that for evidence collection in future prosecutions?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because this is the cutting edge, is much of the information that is going to put the Burmese generals and some Sri Lankan generals in jail, they posted themselves on Facebook and on the internet. It's amazing what people will post while they're trying to incite violence or while they're trying to claim credit for it on their social media platforms. And so you want to find a way that you don't allow that to be used to incite violence, but that you've held it on the server so that it can be accessed with a warrant by the International Criminal Court or if there is an ad hoc tribunal. And the reality is what your parents told you was true. Everything you put on the internet will be there forever even if you delete it or even if it's blocked by the company, it's still held in these servers. And PLPG at the moment is working on a program, documentation, and we're doing in Iraq, South Sudan, and a few other places, and we're trying to figure out how we can get not only the documentation that our folks on the ground collect, but how we can also copy over with the consent of these high-tech companies who haven't done such a great job of culling it, but get it over into a database that could then be used by a future tribunal. South Sudan has a hybrid tribunal as part of its peace agreement. It hasn't launched yet, but it's going to need data and documentation. And we all go to Google to get answers to our questions. We're going to go to Google to get evidence. And it's quite good evidence because of the metadata, the timestamp, the location stamp, the GPS. It's like your Snapchats that you use. We can see all your friends are. You can find all the friends of the war criminals and see where they were if you get access through Snapchat, because there's heavy intrusion of that type of high tech into these environments. There's one right behind you, Michael. Oh, good. I'm trying to save you a few steps.
Hi, my name is Charan Abba from Cleveland Marshall. My question is, what would you say to the critics of the ICC who say that it's mainly targeting poor African countries in terms of prosecution?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that question because I don't actually have any mellow answers to your questions. So prefacing this with, and what the crux of the question is, the African Union and many of African states have said, whoa, wait a second, there's this International Criminal Tribunal, Ivory Coast, Uganda, Central African Republic, the Congo, Kenya, Libya. What about Colombia, Georgia, Sri Lanka, other places? I work for the Darfur rebels. I've worked with civil society in Kenya. We've done work in Ivory Coast with the victims. Yes, it's outrageous that Africa is getting so much justice and the other countries aren't getting their access to justice. It's become a narrative by those in charge that, this is too much of a focus on Africa. No, it's not enough focus on everywhere else. And so when we work with our Darfuri clients, one of the situations was, to morph this a little bit, is the African Union, which was negotiating a peace. The former president of South Africa, Mbeki, is negotiating a peace with the Darfuris, Blue Nile, Southern Kordofan. And the ICC indicted President Bashir, because if Jim Johnson can indict Taylor, why can't Ocampo indict Bashir? Oh, this is terrible. You're going to ruin our peace process. Next month, the Darfur peace process starts up again. Where is Bashir? Bashir is in the prison in Khartoum where he had put former Darfur rebels and others that he was torturing and imprisoning and doing. And the odd thing is, we're with the Darfuris, like, yes, this is great because you can move him to The Hague and stand trial for the ICC, just like Milosevic went to The Hague. And their answer, is, yeah, they have ping pong tables. It's kind of like a WeWork. They have ping pong tables. They have ice cream. We want him to sit here for a little while longer and experience that detention center and try him on corruption because they want the money to be able that he's absconded with before they send him to Hague for international justice. But I'd put money on the fact that as they go into the negotiations and they start to worry about the counter-revolution, and in most places there is movement for a counter-revolution, they're going to think, Bashir and two others that are indicted, if they go to The Hague, and that will clear the field. So you'll have this narrative of too much justice for Africa, but then in the specifics where you're at a very granular level working with the victims, they're like, the ICC. Gbagbo was the former president of the Ivory Coast. There were contested elections, and they sent him to The Hague for trial for crimes that he committed during the elections. And the Hague said, well, you're not liable. We're not going to let the prosecution proceed. The prosecution had said, well, we want to appeal this. And they said, okay, but you're going back to the Ivory Coast. And the Ivory Coast said, oh, we're still doing our democratic transformation. He's in Belgium while he waits out his appeal before the ICC. So on a very practical level, it really has moved the peace process forward in a number of ways. So I know that's the opposite day kind of answer to your question, and I'm happy to chat more about it. But I'm very much, if other countries had as much justice as Africa was getting, you might have more durable peace in some of these places. Yes.
Hello again.
Hi, how you doing?
My name is George Commander, a 2L student here at Case. My question is based on your earlier comment that you made about peace first wash or something like that. You know, I'm from Sierra Leone, so I experienced the war, and I know how confusing and perplexing it could be for people who have been victim of the situation. So my question is based on all your experiences, you know, how often do you see parties when these peace negotiations are like basically they have no middle ground that they can meet, you know, because it could be more than one party or multiple parties were involved. You know, how often do you think that people are sat for peace first or justice first on the other hand? Because sometimes it's a matter of strategy than reality, you know, for people to ask for one thing, but in reality they need that comfort of peace, you know, in the existence. I just want to know, based on your own experience, how often do that occur?
Okay. I'll use your question to hit another one of my favorite things I like to talk about. Is your question is, in a peace negotiation, when there's peace versus justice, and one side is arguing for justice, how often does one side argue for justice? You also asked in terms of how often peace, but it's like, peace. You know, the government side, the side that's committing the atrocities, peace first. The mediators, I want my Nobel Peace Prize. I got to go on summer holiday. Let's do peace first so we can get this done. The victims, the other side, oftentimes goes with peace first as well, because negotiations are all about the guys with guns. And this is something that you want to think about when you're analyzing peace processes and the role of accountability. Peace processes are not inclusive. You got the government, which usually has its army, which is doing its thing, which sometimes includes committing atrocities. And you have the rebels, which may or may not be committing atrocities, but they have guns. And so who do you invite to the peace process? The guys with guns. And maybe civil society will do a workshop down on the other side of Lake Geneva. And maybe, you'll have the UN in the Syrian peace process that we work on has two different women's groups that come to Geneva and kind of talk to the UN envoy, but at a completely different hotel. And then you sit down with the guys with guns. And they're like, amnesty. We've worked with so many clients who they'll say, they're clever now, they say, PLPG, we'd like you to write us a paragraph or two on transitional justice. I'm like, okay, sure, we're happy to do that. Not really sure we can fit it in a paragraph or two. I'm like, no, it's pretty simple. There shall be a complete amnesty. I'm like, that's not even a paragraph, that's just a sentence. And then we chat with them about it. An example that we had when we were in Yemen, in the Movenpick Hotel, doing this was after the failed national dialogue on constitutions, we were doing the ceasefire agreement between the Houthis, which had taken over the capital where we were, and the government, which was under siege at the presidential palace. And so the Movenpick Hotel, which has ice cream, was the, because it's Swiss, they have to have ice cream, was the safe place. And I looked around the table and it was just guys, just armed forces. But in the national dialogue, the women and the youth and the marginalized populations had been empowered. They literally busted into the room and sat around the table and said, yep, we're here for the ceasefire talks. Both the government and the Houthis rebels said, this is men's work. What are you doing here? This is a ceasefire. Yeah, national dialogue, constitution. Yeah, that's great, but this is a ceasefire. This is men's work. And the envoy, Jamal Ben Ammar, he smiled ear to ear, and he just sat there, and the women stayed to sit in, and they wouldn't leave. And then they were involved eventually in that process, which led to the signing. And the way that Jamal Ben Ammar was very clever, he said, okay, we'll have to make this an all-party ceasefire. And there were 17 political parties, and a number of them were headed by women or had senior women in their leadership. So he made it an all-parties ceasefire, and the signing ceremony had all 17 of those parties sign. But there was no movement unless they basically literally physically busted into the room and said, we're sitting here. And so what you'll find is that if it's an inclusive process, the communities want some element of justice. And I'll end my answer with Colombia. But if it is just the guys with guns, you're going to get immunity, you're going to get rotating presidencies, which they have in Bosnia. You can get dual prime ministers because every guy with a gun needs a position in the new government. Sri Lanka had 54 cabinet members. They didn't have a room big enough to hold their cabinet meetings in the entire country because there's so many cabinet members. In Colombia, they negotiated the government with the FARC, the armed group. They created a peace tribunal. They created a justice tribunal, and they put this, and there's ICC, International Criminal Court jurisdiction on Colombia. They put the peace agreement to the people in a referendum, and they flipped through and said, where's the justice? Whoa, peace tribunal, justice tribunal, ICC. Nah, not enough justice. And they rejected the referendum for the Colombia peace process. Now, the parliament then sort of changed it from British English to American English and changed the semicolons to the colons and then adopted it itself and said, oh, we don't need a referendum now because we fixed it. And they've begun to implement the process. And the main critique of the Colombia process, which we use on paper as a model for a comprehensive process, is still getting frowny face emojis on Facebook from the Colombians because there isn't enough justice woven into the process. And so it's a long answer to your question. Peace process tends to tilt toward amnesty because of the group that is there. The more you can make it an inclusive peace process, you'll get a better ceasefire, a better constitution, you'll get more accountability, you'll get more of a durable process. Mike, we have 4 minutes, another question or two?
One last question.
Okay, I'll let you make sure.
Hi, I'm Naomi, and I'm a 1L here at CASE. So the Amazon rainforest is on fire, and
Yes.
many are attributing that to Bolsonaro's failure to act out against cattle ranchers who are illegally burning the fire. What mechanisms are in place to hold him or his administration accountable for failure to act?
Yeah. So at the moment, the International Criminal Court would not likely have jurisdiction because the jurisdiction for what we've been discussing comes through some type of armed activity, either an international conflict or a non-international armed conflict. So this is why your question is so good, is there's an amazing body of law relating to genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, but it's only applicable to the hot armed conflicts that we've been discussing. There's a whole group of activity out there relating to global warming, relating to what's happening with the rainforest, that has substantial and dire consequences in a different way, but there isn't a judicial mechanism to address that. There's a world court, and many years ago, a number of small island states tried to take the permanent 5 members of the Security Council to the World Court to get a resolution, basically a judgment saying they're committing global warming, the sea's going to rise, these islands are going to go out of business as states. That wasn't able to get any traction that it needed. So there is actually a gap of international law in the criminal sphere that can be used to hold them accountable. That said, many countries are very dynamic and very assertive and very aggressive on economic sanctions. There's an entire bureau, Office of Foreign Assets Control, the US Treasury, which is doing sanctions constantly. This is where political advocacy, legal advocacy could move in that direction for the cattle ranchers, for the corporate entities. There's a number of instances where these economic crimes, which have led to dire consequences, can then get the political action to engage with some type of economic sanctions. But there is a gap there in terms of that criminal accountability. And when you think about it, as I end, is the era of impunity up until basically the early 90s ran rampant. Nearly all the countries which thought impunity was a good idea have come back and embraced justice. Since 90, you've seen almost every country except for Yemen that comes out of conflict have some degree of accountability, but it's a tough slog and it's a tough fight, and that's only in the little universe of armed conflict. So as you go through your paths, your careers, where you're engaged with social justice, you'll want to be thinking about what lessons you can learn from these peace agreements, from these tribunals, from economic crimes, from environmental crimes, and how to be able to develop mechanisms. I think one thing that in the last 10 seconds that I and Michael and Milena have learned is that you can build these mechanisms. Mike played a key role in drafting the UN Security Council resolution under Chapter 7 to create the Yugoslavia Tribunal, which has put heads of state and others in jail. Jim Johnson, prosecutor Charles Taylor, put him in jail. Robert Petit, who's been here before in the past, was the co-prosecutor for Cambodia, who put the Pol Pot leaders, the Khmer Rouge leaders, in jail for their war crimes and their genocide. As young lawyers, as you go through your career, you can actually build mechanisms and participate in mechanisms that hold individuals accountable for their war crimes, their atrocities, the bad things that people do to other people. And so I would very much encourage you to be optimistic, which I know none of my answers were optimistic, but I would encourage you to be optimistic as you pursue social justice throughout your career. Thank you very much for spending your time with me, and thank you for the award.
All right, couple of quick announcements before you all leave. First of all, you've been very patient to be with us during our lunch hour. We were going to provide pizzas during the presentation, but there were so many people here, it would have been distracting. So if you are hungry, there are many pizzas in the rotunda for you to grab on your way out. Secondly, we have many very interesting conferences coming up. The next big one is September 20th. It's on the role of international law and justice in stopping atrocities. And so it's a continuation of this theme. We hope you'll join us. It'll be in this room, and there are going to be about 30 of the world's biggest experts, including a return of Paul Williams and Melina Stereo at that conference. And then thirdly, for those of you who are 1Ls or 2Ls who are interested in international law, we are starting our tryouts for Jessup, ICC, and VIS Moot Court, and we do encourage all of you, including the 1Ls, to try out. There are 1Ls every year on our teams. They do really well, and we have found that it does not negatively affect their grades, but rather positively does. So think about it seriously. We hope you'll think about that. We will have on September 4th a CASE Global Information Session to tell you all about the programs, and we'll have our student leaders and our faculty leaders tell you about the different extracurricular activities and journals and moot court teams. So I hope to see a lot of you there. For you alums, thank you for your support. For the professors who are here, thank you for everything you do. Steve Petrus, the new director of the Cox Center, I just want you to stand up for a second. Thank you for taking over this wonderful activity. And finally, one last time, the actual language of this is the, yes, thank you. The Humanitarian Award for Advancing Global Justice. There could be no better recipient than this year than Paul Williams. Once again, a big thank you to Paul Williams and a congratulations.